Welcome, everyone, to our Immigration in the Late 1800s review. All right, looking at PowerPoint question number one. What countries, or regions can you trace your family history to? List all you can think of, and do you and your family still follow any customs or traditions from these countries of origin? And first of all, I want to thank all of you for sharing a little bit about your family history and experiences with me this week. And it's pretty amazing that just in our class alone, our students can trace their cultural heritage to back to over 30 locations around the world. And it's really amazing how important our family histories still are in our lives and how they continue to help form and shape our identities. And I really believe that this link to our own personal past is just another one of the many reasons that people are interested in learning about history. It's also a really great reminder that except for those who had an American Indian ancestor or those whose ancestors were brought to our country by force or against their will, that for the most part all of our ancestors immigrated from somewhere at some time. And many of the motivations for their decision to immigrate to the United States were very similar, whether it was to seek a better life for them or their families, more opportunities to escape persecution or danger in their homelands. A lot of similarity for the people in our class whose ancestors or parents or relatives or themselves have immigrated to our country, um, as well as those from the time period that we're talking about today. So, thank you all very much for sharing a little bit about yourselves. All right, moving on to question number two. What factors contributed to the great increase in immigration to the United States between the years 1877 and 1900? Really very good answers across the board on this question. The increase in immigration during the last half of the 19th century is really just one more aspect of the really litany of changes our nation was experiencing. Just as we've been discussing the past few weeks with westward expansion and industrialization, all of these monumental changes were very much interlinked and influenced each other. Many of you jumped on the link between industrialization and immigration very quickly. The new need for increased labor and the corporate model to keep competition high and wages low created an almost insatiable demand for unskilled workers during this time period. Really, the close link forged between industrial capitalists and politicians made sure that, for the most part, immigration would be nearly an open door. Of course, the expansion into the West and the increase in wage earning opportunities contributed to reasons why individuals from other nations also sought the United States as a destination. And this was often combined with factors of poverty, repression, violence, or simply a lack of opportunity within many countries within Europe. So I'd say all these things really had parts to play in contributing to this great increase that we see. But pretty remarkable that through immigration and just natural increase, the population almost doubles between this time period we're talking about, between 1877 and 1900. And really was going to change the face and the shape of the United States moving forward. All right, PowerPoint question number three. What similarities do you notice between immigration debates of the late 1800s and the immigration debates of today? Many of you made some really interesting comparisons in this question. Indeed, many of the same issues surrounding immigration and the ways immigrants are treated and perceived today are the exact same ones our nation has been struggling with since the rise of American industry and capitalism. Many of the same concerns over the skill of laborers, the language skills, the cultural conflicts are just the same today for immigrant groups as it was for the Germans, the Irish, the Poles, the Italians, and the Jews from the time period that we're talking about. Remember that these groups were all at one point in time viewed as being dangerous foreigners with strange religions and cultures who were uninterested or incapable of joining American society. Um, and where exactly are all these fears now for all these various groups? They're pretty much non-existent, right? That's why I think it's really important to note that, once these immigrant groups live within the United States for a few generations, these conflicts and fears begin to abate as second and third generations are nearly culturally indistinguishable from the larger national culture. Now, this doesn't mean that these groups have assimilated or lost their cultural heritage, as many of them continue to enjoy strong cultural traditions. Rather, it really just means that the natural processes of cultural borrowing and acculturation have taken place. And this is a natural process that happens, when you get people from multiple cultural groups living within close proximity to one another. But this process really goes both ways, as all these immigrant groups have also contributed to reforming our national culture and national identity as well. And really, I think it's so too it will be with our modern, more recent arrivals. In another generation or so, many of the contentious issues that surrounding the immigration debates now um, will likely become, essentially non-issues into the future because, as you can see, I think from the material we covered today, this all seems very cyclical, and every new group comes in with a lot of the same motivations. They're met with a lot of times the same resistance, but ultimately, just through the process of time and enculturation, those differences seem to abate and subside, and American culture becomes more and more familiar and comfortable with the new arrivals into our country. What are some of the positive aspects to the growth of cities, and what were some of its negative aspects? Question number 4 here. I thought everyone also did a great job answering this question. As much as cities became thriving locations of trade and commerce, attracting diverse individuals to come and live and work together, these early cities were also really horribly overcrowded, unsanitary, and unhealthy. Also, cities often reinforce the racial, ethnic, and social divides within our nation. For better or worse, the influx of population and the creation of these large cities really changed the way the majority of Americans lived, worked, and interacted with their environments. And it's really incredible to look at how the country went from a largely rural nation to a mostly urban nation within that same 50-year time period we've been talking about towards the end of the late 19th century, and all the ramifications and impact that was ultimately going to have. All right, PowerPoint question number 5. What do you see as the most important outcomes or impacts of the increased immigration and urbanization of this time period? Once more, pretty much the entire class did a very excellent job of detailing the important economic and cultural impacts that immigration and urbanization had during this time period. The corporate industrial structure of our country was largely developed and based on these changes. The inclusion of all these diverse people, cultures, and ideas within a short amount of time greatly altered American culture, from the food that we eat, to the accents in our different locations and regions of the country, to our art. Almost all portions of American culture were impacted by these new arrivals. The fact that so many immigrants moved to urban areas just helped to the speed of which these diverse people were able to really share their cultures and ideas. And all this had an incredible mark on how Americans perceived themselves and how the United States was perceived by the rest of the world. The inclusion of diversity and the incorporating of many diverse perspectives and cultures would eventually become seen as a strength and a vital part of the American identity. And although, as you have seen from this week, that many were skeptical, fearful, and hostile to such changes during these early days, this time period also put America on the map internationally as a desired destination, and kind of reinforced that idea of America as a land of opportunity. Although the course, of these promises were oftentimes over-exaggerated, it's really still impossible to look at the country we have today without considering the impacts that this time period had. Alright, moving on to our document exercises now. We'll start with question number 18.2.1. What does each of the main figures in the cartoon represent? And you did a really good job this week using the political cartoons to take a deeper look at how immigration was perceived and debated during this time period. And in this first question here, everyone did a really good job of identifying kind of the middle class man and his family seated at the table. It's important to note the emphasis on the middle class rather than the upper class, as you can see that this image was meant to spark a reaction from a particular group of people. Also, many of you picked up on the culturally insensitive depiction of the immigrant. This too is playing off very well established stereotypes from this time period. Notice how the image depicted the immigrant essentially stepping up the boat and into the pocketbook of the middle class, perhaps a skilled laborer in this case. Also, there was a good debate that I saw on the discussion board about whether the immigrant was white or not, and this was a really great discussion and shows how conflated race and ethnicity were at this time period. Remember that even though they had white skin, many Americans considered these new immigrants from South and Eastern Europe to be non-white individuals. The dark skin color of the immigrant in this picture is really no mistake, and is drawing upon these deep-seated racial prejudices within the United States had already developed. Alright, going on to question number 18.2. How does the cartoon's two settings, Ellis Island and the working man's home, compare to one another? And there's really a lot of diverse responses to this question, which is fine, and many of these questions, there's really no one single right answer. Some of you saw the comparison of the working man's home with just a few people in the Ellis Island, kind of teeming of new arrivals, kind of showing the influx of these new people into the country. Some people saw it as how close in proximity it was, making a point that even though New York may seem a long way away, the perceived negative impact of immigration can reach into any working man's home. Number 18.2.3, what point is the cartoonist trying to make? And the cartoonist here really seems to be making a very nativist political point with the depiction, as many of you have identified. The cartoonist is obviously placing the blame for any troubles the working man is experiencing on the arrival of new immigrants. And this was perpetuated by many at this time period, and has been since. However, this view, of course, is really kind of completely ignores the larger economic shift from skilled to unskilled labor which was occurring during this time period. And placing the blame on immigrants also completely ignores the role that business was playing in emphasizing unskilled labor, keeping wages low and competition high, and all of which really had a much greater impact on the livelihood of the skilled workers at this point in time than the presence of immigrants into the country. Of course, the political and business elite were more than happy to try to keep conflicts between the working classes going, and between skilled and unskilled laborers, and between new and old immigrant groups. The more they could keep the working class kind of fighting amongst themselves, the more the people who were at the top of this kind of industrial complex were ensured that there would be no kind of unified uprising against them, as they really realized that the current economic situation was benefiting them far more than anyone else. All right, question number 18.2-4. How might the immigrant laborer from this era respond to this cartoon? How would he or she defend his or her decision to immigrate to the United States? And I thought all of you gave very reflective responses to this question. Everyone pretty much stated that the immigrants would take exception, of course, to such a depiction as the man in this picture. Many of you brought up the point that many of the new immigrants would bring up the fact that they were simply trying to take advantage of the same opportunities that had been granted to the earlier waves of immigration. That many times these immigrants are simply looking for opportunities to find a better life for themselves or their families. Some of you mentioned that these immigrants were escaping persecution and violence in their home countries, and would feel surprised to find it kind of waiting for them in America as well. Alright, moving on to our next image here, number 18.4.1. Who does each figure in the cartoon represent? Which characters are depicted sympathetically and which are represented critically? Once more, very good job of analyzing this image and teasing out its deeper meanings. The Chinese immigrant on the ground is meant to stand for the Chinese immigrants group as a whole. The woman standing protectively over him is supposed to represent the inclusive spirit of Colombia, essentially an idealized form of America. If you remember back to the document exercise about the Indian school celebration, one of the students was also in that document embodying the spirit of Colombia within the pageant. In this cartoon, Colombia is expressing the American ideal of inclusivity, which was discussed above, but kind of telling the angry mob that America means fair play for all men. The angry mob, of course, represents those who are in favor of Chinese exclusion, whether the politicians pushing for the ban or those on the ground who are using methods of violence or intimidation against Chinese immigrants. And this group is very much being viewed critically within this document. So number 18.4.2, how do these words describing the Chinese in the posters contrast and compare with the actions of the men on the right? Many of you did a great job of depicting the irony present in this poster. Although the hateful statements were made towards the Chinese immigrants, it's really clear from the cartoon that they more accurately depict the actions and the presence of the angry mob of anti-Chinese Americans. And this hypocrisy, which often stems from hate groups, many times, kind of are embodied in this, and reflect kind of the hateful rhetoric that they espouse and direct at others, are in fact the same actions that they are taking. And certainly the artist within this cartoon saw that and wanted to depict that kind of ingrown hypocrisy with kind of embedded within hate groups. Number 4, 18.4.3, what is the point of view of the cartoonist regarding the Chinese question? Is he for or against Chinese exclusion? And finally, after everything we mentioned above, it becomes very clear that the cartoonist is decidedly opposed to Chinese exclusion and is in favor of allowing the Chinese the same immigration rights afforded to those coming from Europe during this time period. Alright, that is all I have for today. Of course, if you have any questions about your response, your grade from this week, or anything else, make sure to let me know. Other than that, I hope you have another great week of work.